This video is about dividing integers and what are the rules and how we apply that. So we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to remember some of our rules from multiplying, and that multiplying refers to groups of things. And so does dividing in a way. It does refer to groupings. It's just set up a little bit differently. So multiplying and division are related. They are inverses of each other, but they do have quite a bit in common. We're going to use the word average in a couple of our examples. We're going to take the average of a set of integers, and we'll talk about how we do that a little later. But another word for average is mean. So you might have heard before to take a mean of a number. So here we have a standard multiplication problem that 4 times 2 equals 8. But we need to understand that that's really talking about 4 groups of positive 2. So if I had all positives here and I made 4 groups of positive 2, altogether I would be equal to 8. Well, in division, it pretty much means the same thing as well. I have 8 pieces here, and I want to make 4 groupings. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4 groupings, and there's 2 in each group. So that's really what it's meant by 8 divided by 4 equals 2. We can do the same thing when it comes to negative numbers. We have 4 sets of negative 2. There's 1 set, 2 sets, 3 sets, 2 negatives in each set, and that gives us negative 8. That also will be looked at through our division lens, where I have 8 negatives and I put them into 4 groupings, and we can see that there are 2 negatives in each grouping. So if we think about it in those terms, we can see the connection, and we're going to see that connection a little bit as well. You might actually see that connection here. Here everything's positive. Here I have 1 negative. You'll see 1 negative on one side of the equal sign and 1 on the other. The same is true over here. So you're going to start to see some patterns that are very similar to multiplication. So basically, if I was to have some rules, let me tell you, the rules are very similar to those as multiplication. And that's what we're going to look at one by one here. So if I had a positive and I divided it by another positive, it would turn out to be positive. And we just saw that a moment ago. If I took positive 8, and I made 4 groupings, there would be 2 in each grouping. Now, if I did it a little bit differently, which was again what we just saw a moment ago, right? If I had 8 negatives and I made 4 groupings, there would be 2 negatives in each grouping. So these 2 are pretty straightforward. So when we get to the other 2, that sometimes bringing in those words the opposite of really help out. So I want positive 8, and I want the opposite of 4 groupings of positive 8. Well, the opposite of 4 groupings of positive 8 happens to be 4 groupings of negative 8. So that's where that comes into negative 2. So we can kind of see a correlation between these 2 problems, right? One of them is negative, yielding us a negative result. And the last one we have here is a negative divided by a negative equals a positive, and we can say that in terms of the groupings. Again, if I have negative 8, I want the opposite of 4 sets of negative 8. Well, the opposite of dividing negative 8 into 4 sets would be dividing positive 8 into 4 sets. So that's where that positive 2 comes in. So if we can think of it in terms of groupings, it's still similar to when we were multiplying. So the rules are still the same. And we might remember that, we said earlier about negative times a negative is a positive. Well, dividing 2 negatives will yield a positive as well. So let's take a look at a couple other rules, some other important ones that we need to always remember, especially when we're dealing with fractions and division, is that 0 divided by any number is equal to 0. In other words, if I have nothing and I try to put nothing into 5 groups, it equals 0. I can't put nothing into any group, so it's still nothing. In those groups, there is nothing in those groups. Which brings us to the next one, which is any number divided by 0 is undefined. So let's think about what that means. 5 divided by 0. Can I take 5 items and put them into 0 piles? What would be in each pile? Well, that's impossible. So because it's impossible, that's what makes it undefined. It's undefinable in what we know right now. So we might want to kind of apply a little bit of multiplication in here as well. If you think about it, and I'm going to go back a screen here, I'm I'm going to do some highlighting here because I think that if we see this, it would make a little bit more sense. So if we were to multiply 4 times 2, wouldn't that yield us 8? The same thing with 4 times negative 2 yields us negative 8. Negative 4 times negative 2 yields us positive 8. And negative 4 times positive 2 gave us negative 8. So again, there's our multiplication rules hiding within the division. We can use that with this 0 idea because we can also notice that 5 times 0 equals 0. And the reason this is undefined because we just don't know of any number that we could multiply by 0 to get 5. It's undefinable in what we know at this time. So that's where this comes from, and that might be a way to think about the difference between the two of them if you had to know the difference. So let's just do one little problem here. And basically what this problem is asking is that if I have 24 and I wanted to put them into 24 sets, that would have yielded 1, but I want the opposite of that. So that's why this is going to yield negative 1. So positive divided by negative is a negative, and that is why. So let's kind of look at some real world applications though of where we would add positives and negatives and divide and do all that stuff. So where that comes into play is when we're doing averages. And when we do averages, we add up all the numbers and then divide by how many numbers you have. So here's a scenario of when we talk about going bowling. So when we go bowling, you may have several series of games, but they always want to know what your bowling average is. So here we have some numbers: 155, 145, 160, 185, and 150. So we're going to take a moment here and we're going to add them all up. And while we do that, these are legitimate bowling averages, bowling games. These are basically 5 games that were done, and they wanted to know what the average was. Yeah, I think that's 9, 11, 18, 19. Yeah. Shouldn't talk and add at the same time. Okay, so we're going to find out that that's 795. So we're trying to find the average. So because there are 5 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we are going to divide by 5. And we're going to do some quick division here. 5 goes into 7 one time. And then 5 goes into 29 5 times. I'm going to move my screen down just a tad here. And then 5 goes into 45 9 times. And that's how it ends. And so we find out that our bowling average is 159. Easy to do when it's just all positive integers. But what happens when we start to get some negative ones? So let's look at one more problem, which is a real world problem. And it's talking about football yardage. I'm a big football fan, so I kind of enjoy doing this. So here I have a team that's going down the field. They've committed 5 plays here. Let's see what's happened. They've moved 10 yards in a positive direction down the field. They lost 5 yards, picked up another 7 yards, then 9 more yards, and then they lost 11 yards. The quarterback got sacked. So I want to know how my team's doing over 5 plays. So now there's a couple different ways that we can do this. One of the ways that you can attack this is that add the positive numbers, then add the negative numbers, and then put it all together. So let's list the numbers on the correct side. So the 10 goes on the positive, negative 5 on the negative, 7 on the positive, 9 on the positive, and negative 11 on the negative. So as we're looking at this, we're going to add up these numbers here. So I have 26 positives and I have negative 16 on the negatives. If I add these two numbers together, I'm going to get positive 10. Now remember, we're trying to find the average of what this team is doing. So if I take 10 and I divide it by 5 because I have 5 numbers, it's going to yield me 2. So my team on average gains 2 yards on every play. Probably not a very good football team, but room for improvement. And this is how we use analysis out in the real world. Now another way that we might do this, instead of dividing it up, we might just work left to right. So if I was to do that, I would start with 10 plus negative 5. Well, I know that 10 plus negative 5 is positive 5. So then I would go to the next number, which is 7. 5 plus 7 is equal to 12. Add my next number, which is a positive 9. 12 plus 9 is 21. And then my last number, which is negative 11. 12 plus Oops, sorry, I meant to put 21 there. Didn't mean 12, sorry. 21 plus negative 11 equals 10. So we can still see we're getting to the same number at the bottom. And again, we would just take that 10 divided by 5. We find out it equals 2. So there are different ways to go about it, whichever way you feel most comfortable. So hopefully this explains a little bit more about dividing integers and the rules that we use.